Hey traders, this is Christian Farmer. It's Tribeca Trade Group, and it is Thursday, January 23rd. A little bit different day from what we had yesterday. Yesterday was kind of a deterioration in breadth, in market breadth, and it seemed like today we kind of got the opposite. All in all, right? It was one of those days where things looked a little bit dire, with China really selling off overnight, and and we woke up this morning and S&P futures were really not that far down. Kind of felt like we should have started the day down about a 0.5% or so, considering that Europe was also down, and instead we got a little bit of selling pressure on the open. From there, we kind of built on the day. This was right at 9 o'clock in the morning, 9:30. Notice that. So what I have up is the S&P futures 1 hour. Something that I tweeted out earlier was, hey, we're kind of coming in and testing support. The 1 hour, I really spent a lot of time on today in various different names, just checking to see if we're basically in value, which basically means range, kind of in a range for the time being, or just digestion or consolidating, versus underneath value, which is kind of to me breaking down. Or if we're just kind of coming into the top of value, coming into support, but the trend is still intact. So the takeaway here from S&P is we kind of came in and tested that support and bounced nicely. So all in all, up 20 basis points. It's one of those things that if you're kind of a either a long-term holder, or if you're a longer-term swing trader, and you're not making too many adjustments day to day, probably not a big deal. Uh, you know, if you weren't day trading or anything like that. But today kind of set up for some day trades, that people were taking advantage of the weakness again, because it seems like when we do kind of come in a little bit, it just brings out the buyers in this market. Also, I think what was helped today is the we already kind of were bouncing a little bit, before the World Health Organization came out and said that this virus that's going around, they did not essentially declare it an emergency yet. They said that they're going to keep an eye on it. So it's one of those things where we're very, now, of course, nowadays, and probably always in trading, but even more so nowadays, because we get so many details on tidbits of news, especially from Twitter. I have Bloomberg up at all times, and I'm listening to that. As they report more and more cases of this, you start to think, that this is really getting bad and nasty. The fact that the World Health Organization did not come out right away and say that they've got like a major epidemic on their hands, just kind of proves that, to me. Now, I don't know if they're going to be right in the end of this. I think maybe, personally, a little bit early to declare, and that was why I think some of the other headlines that came out after, the first initial headline that came out that said that um, they're not exactly causing it an emergency. Yeah, the other headlines coming out were that they're going to really keep close tabs on it and how it's developing. So that was enough, I think, to kind of give markets a reprieve and a lift. Some of those beaten up like travel names and China names, they started to rebound. We actually saw some call buying that was going on early in the day in the Chinese names, even though China is going to be closed for about a week with their New Year. They were still buying things like the Chinese Internet ETF, KWeb. We saw a little bit of call buying in this, so I wanted to cover this first, and then we'll get to some of the other movers of the day. You know, things like this outright bet February 50 calls. There's a couple other smaller trades that went up. Also ASHR, which is the Shanghai ETF, that has all local shares in it. You could see 9.3 times normal volume for the day. And we saw a couple trades go up there, like this one. This was an opening trade, 4,000 of the March 30 calls. Somebody taking, not a huge shot, premium 176,000, going with some out of the money calls. I think those ended up marking around 50 or a little bit above at the end of the day, so they had a nice little gain there. We also saw things like PDD, which it's funny. This name, this PDD, we seem to see call buying on dips in this thing, and then we see put buying when it's rallying too. So I don't know, maybe somebody playing the momentum, because it is a very highly momentum name. A little bit of BABA calls as well, so that was interesting. We also saw some win calls, so definitely some dip buying in the space. Win, took out a 1 hour VPOC in the day. But in terms of performance, one of the things that I said early on was that, hey, be objective about what you're seeing on the tape, in terms of price action, because this morning we started to feel like some of those things that kind of my end of day message was that we're seeing a little bit of deterioration in sectors. Uh, well, being objective, those things kind of turned around a little bit. One of the things that I started to kind of see, other than what I noted yesterday, steel stocks, energy stocks, I started to see the materials start to break down, and they came back today. So, there's something to be said for that. Nice bullish engulfing. Some of the banks like J.P. Morgan looked like that was starting to break down as well, and that came back, finished flat on the day. So I think that's not that bad. I don't know why Thinkorswim keeps doing that. Still in value for the day, but you could see definitely started to lean to the downside. Taiwan Semiconductor was a name that I was watching early because I started a position because this thing has been worked really well buying dips. But if we bring out the Taiwan Semiconductor, I don't know why Thinkorswim keeps doing this. This was doing this in yesterday's video too. Not really doing this during the day, but here you go. So again, you got like a nice, hammer bar that's in here, but you could see it is, it needs to maybe consolidate a little bit more. But I think the fact that it didn't break down, um, very small win, and one of the best performing semiconductor names. I'll get to Intel in a second. Saw a lot of calls in that thing today. Interesting. Big calls in Intel, which we've been seeing now for weeks, and puts in SMH. And the puts, when you see puts in SMH, often they are a hedge, but we don't really know that, right? We don't know for sure. But there was an awful lot of puts that were going up in SMH today, and then the calls. I might as well just go ahead and show you the calls in Intel while I'm at it. But they were buying a little. They've been, like I said, they've been going after these for a while. But this was the trade. This was one of the trades. But this was the June 2020 70 calls that went up for $1.60, and those repeated a couple times. You should find them further down here as well. I think there was here as well. So someone really liked Intel, and I've been saying that for a while. They were coming into Intel now for weeks, and I think you'll find that on my Twitter as well. If you see how many times I tweeted about Intel for a while, it kind of wasn't working. When they started coming in, I think they were buying September's originally. See if I can see if it's within 2 weeks. Feb, May, all over the place. For some reason, I thought, yeah, here's the September's. This was on 115, but yeah, they were positioning. Here's another one. These were the 75 calls as well. So someone has been positioning in this for a couple weeks, and then interesting on earnings day. One of the things that I try to point out just from experience is that um, options on around earnings are very difficult to read, but once in a while you see something like this where they're just accumulating and then put up a big trade on earnings day, and it really works. Just bear that in mind. Sometimes we see the same, maybe not the exact same type of flow, but sometimes we see option flow the day of, or a day before earnings, and it doesn't really correspond to what you're looking for. This sense it worked. It definitely worked. It's up to what, 77. So really nice move. So I wanted to point that out. I try to point out as many times as possible. Sometimes when they work and sometimes when they don't. Um, you know, because it is what it is. Like we were talking about Nike in yesterday's video, that didn't work. I was even just talking about how I thought the calls were too far away. And Nike finished down 1.4% for the day. So those calls, unless something miraculous happens in that name, most likely that option trade won't work. So again, I try to be as objective as possible. I do think, and I put out a couple of statements in the room today just about how option flow I think is very difficult around earnings. I really, and and I stand by this. I really try to trade lighter around around earnings. I think the flow, reading the flow is very noisy, but in this sense, it worked pretty well. All right, so I'll move on. Um, I want to talk about the home builders. Home builders breaking out all over the place. Really impressive. It's funny. Today was, every once in a while you have a frustrating day. Today, this was a frustrating day for me because I've been very careful about cutting positions around earnings and so forth. But this ITB, I was in a trade for probably about a month in ITB, and it's one of those things where it's a good lesson to learn. Again, I try to provide lessons so that you don't make the same. Not that it was a mistake, but I was holding on to ITB January January calls, and they expired last week, and I did not roll the position. If I would have went out to the February calls, no, of course I would have been taking targets as we went up, but it would have been a huge winner. So it's one of those things where I was waiting. I think I had bought calls. I forget what strike it was, but I bought them originally at around 80 cents. Something like it was like the 46 calls or 47 calls, and for 80 cents, and it just did this. I think here's where I bought them. I averaged down somewhere in here, and then the thing kind of just settled back in here, and I was like, and the calls went all the way down to like 10 cents, and I managed to salvage the trade, like, and get it back to my cost basis, right on like Wednesday of last week. But I didn't do anything, and I looked at the charts, and what I did was I added a couple single stock trades on. I added TPH, which is working. And that's got a VPOC up there. I also added KBH last week, which I'm out of, and this thing has continued to go higher. So that worked. But I feel like I put the analysis in, and just didn't capitalize enough on it. Now I'm also long DHI in the tactical portfolio, which is which is the stock portfolio. So that's fine. That's working. They reports earnings, I believe tomorrow morning, but um, that's great, but I just feel like I should have capitalized it on a little bit more, considering that I just didn't stay with it for a while, because it's been a while in consolidation. But so anyway, this will be one of the last times that I go over this. But when you see something like this, it just kind of like beats you up a little bit, to know that you were right. You just didn't structure the trade the right way, or didn't roll the trade, to give it some more time to work out for you. I talked about the industrials. The utilities have been on an absolute tear. They were up again. I mean, look at the leg in this one. That's impressive for the utilities. So there are things like this that are continuing to break out. Even though we saw uh, as I mentioned yesterday, a few areas starting to break down. Certainly things came back, very strong today. The FANG stocks did well today. Netflix was the star of the day. Really interesting. Closed almost on the lows yesterday, and all of a sudden it comes back. It did take out, I believe it took out this VPOC. Yes, it took out this version point of control. Usually that is not where I want to add a trade, but we'll keep an eye on it. It doesn't always mean that it reverts after that, but that's one hell of a bullish engulfing candle in terms of. I mean, let's see how this looks on the weekly. If weekly doesn't even show that much, just shows that it's kind of moving in the right direction. But in terms of the daily candle, look at how many candles that today's action engulfed, up 23.7, over 7%. It's just funny how that kind of works out. Other trades in other areas, So here's also where I think it's interesting, right? Look at healthcare underperform today, and I think keeping an eye on XBI is interesting here. It's right at the 50-day moving average. Notice the lower high that it made here. I always look at the XBI first because XBI is all biotech. It's got large cap and small cap in there. But this will be interesting to see what it does here. Also, you would think very counterintuitive. There's a big virus going on, and you would think healthcare stocks would be outperforming. Nope. So again, you have to kind of pay attention to the price action and try to avoid some of the headline trading because it isn't always intuitive that you see something going around. Obviously there's a couple stocks that moved higher on the virus and possibly ones that can put together a vaccine, but for the whole group to be down 1.33% versus SPY and Qs which finished higher on the day, just kind of tells you something. A few other stocks that I was watching for the day. I'll cover a couple more trades that we saw in option activity, but I think Ross Stores, that's a nice candle in here. Again, very strong company coming in, after making a high of 122. I think kind of looks interesting here. Starbucks. Also, I went long a little bit of Starbucks at the end of the day. I like that candle. Notice that this took out a VPOC and just kept going, so pretty good strength in there. Note reports earnings on Monday, and right, that's Monday. Tomorrow's the 25th, 26th, 27th. Right, 24th is tomorrow. Yeah, that should be Monday. I think Monday after the close. But the way that this earnings cycle has been going so far, I think is a lot of names are running into the report, and then it becomes kind of a 50-50 on earnings day. So I went long just for a short-term swing. I bought some next week's calls. We'll see if we get some more continuation because the consumer discretionary group seems pretty strong today, other than travel. But even the airlines, after results, JetBlue. Where did JetBlue finish the day? Very strong, big move higher. So again, like counterintuitive to what you would think airline stocks doing well when you have a virus that's basically all the media is talking about today. So again, different than you might think. I had a couple traders come in this morning and they're like, "Hey, should we be shorting some of the stuff?" And I just am not. I made a big point in the pre-market session this morning just to not really jump on these headlines. I just don't think it's worth it. And you can see, maybe your first idea was, "Oh, I'm going to short the airlines today." Nope, that wasn't the trade to do. Uh, a few other names. So LK, kind of interesting. Usually when this happens, when you see a trade like this on the tape, it's usually against shares, meaning like a substitution. But 29,000 of these of the Luckin Coffee 70 strike calls for February. So not sure what they're up to. Of course, we never know exactly what they're up to, but this was not against any shares. I checked. I didn't see a block of stock that went up against that. So, like I said, I spent a lot of time on the 1 hour chart. This did not trigger for me. So I know, for me, because I never know, you never know what their position is. I just kind of use it as a trade idea. I'm watching 45.05 to see if this thing can move back into value. Notice it tried here and it failed. Notice it failed here. A couple times on this hourly. So I wait for a little bit of confirmation, especially when something has been rejected a couple times. So that'll be on my watch list for tomorrow. Some other names, Elon continues to see call activity. I think today July calls. This was a name that I talked about yesterday. I've been long. Animal health, moving up, was basically flat today. But look at the volume that's going on here. So maybe at this point, probably a little bit speculative calls, or more speculative momentum calls today. But I'm still long the name. I mentioned the Chinese internet playing names. Intel, we already covered that one. A little bit of Home Depot calls. Again, it's been a repeater. Tech calls. Somebody this repeated a few times today. I didn't take this trade. somebody maybe thinking that taking advantage of a down move, keep in mind this thing is way underneath the 200-day moving average. So we talked a lot about counter trend trades last week. Maybe this is setting up for a bounce. You could see all the calls that went up in this thing. A lot of March calls trading in this. Xilinx reports next week. We've seen repeat calls in this one. I mentioned the win calls. I think that's just about it. There were some Skechers calls this morning as well out of the gate. So we'll leave it there for the day. We've got one more day of the week. Again, shortened week, so tomorrow's Friday. Guys, have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.